A bitter wind cut through Alara's thin shawl, carrying the scent of pine and coming winter. She stood alone in her ramshackle cabin, her goal immediate and absolute, to survive until the spring thaw. The obstacle was the empty flour sack in her hands and the man, her brother-in-law, who had taken everything else. If she failed, the child growing inside her would be born into a world of cold and hunger, a world where she had nothing left to offer. What you are about to hear is a story not found in official town ledgers, but its truth is etched into the memories of a generation. According to private journals and a sworn affidavit discovered decades later, one woman's desperate act at a public auction would unravel a conspiracy that the town of Redemption Creek tried to bury. But before we get to the shocking revelation that brought hardened miners and stoic farmers to tears, you need to understand what was being sold that day. It was never about a crime, it was about control. The auction square was a pit of jeers and cruel laughter. In the center, a crude iron cage bearing the rusted brand of the Black Creek Mining Company held a man and a small boy. The man was tall and gaunt, his back a map of fresh wounds, his dark hair matted with dirt. He knelt shielding the boy, who was no older than 7, from the crowd's vicious gaze. The town sheriff, a man named Barlow, whose authority was rented from the mining company, declared the man a poacher caught on company land. His sentence was to be sold as an indentured laborer, his son included in the cruel bargain. The practice of indentured servitude as punishment, while officially discouraged, persisted in isolated frontier territories where corporate power often superseded federal law, explains Dr. Eris Thorne, a historian specializing in 19th century frontier justice. These sales were less about law and more about public intimidation. Alara watched from the edge of the crowd, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. Her brother-in-law, Jedediah, stood near the front, his face smug. He had orchestrated this. He had stripped her of her farm after her husband's death and left her destitute, and now he reveled in the town's casual brutality. She saw the boy in the cage, his face pale and emotionless, and she felt a kinship with his terror. That boy and the baby inside her were just property to men like Jedediah. The bidding was a joke, a few silver coins tossed with contempt. Stay with me, because this is where the story truly begins. Jedediah made a final, sneering bid of $5, enough to buy the man and boy for a season of back-breaking work in his fields. The auctioneer was about to call it sold when Alara pushed through the crowd. She ignored the whispers and the stares. She walked to the block and held out her hand. On her palm lay the one thing of value she had left, her thin gold wedding band. "This," she said, her voice barely a whisper but cutting through the noise. "I bid this." A stunned silence fell. Jedediah's face turned purple with rage. The auctioneer, seeing the gleam of gold, snatched the ring without hesitation. He pointed a fat finger at her. "Sold," he boomed, "to the widow." What he didn't know was that he had just sealed his own fate and the fate of the most powerful man in town. The cage lock was stiff, but it finally clicked open. The mountain man, whose name she didn't know, rose slowly. He met her eyes not with gratitude, but with the defiant wariness of a trapped wolf. He took the boy's hand and followed her out of the square, a dozen paces behind, his bare feet making no sound on the hard-packed dirt. The journey to her cabin in the foothills was silent and tense. The man and boy followed, two shadows clinging to her. Her cabin was a sorry sight, leaning against the hillside as if exhausted. The door hung on a single hinge and the wind whistled through cracks in the walls. U.S. Geological survey maps of the era, specifically the 1888 quadrant map of the San Juan Range, show isolated homesteads like hers were often built on land deemed unsuitable for mining or large-scale agriculture. They were places of last resort. Anyone who's faced a brutal winter with inadequate shelter knows the specific kind of fear Alara was feeling. She pushed open the door and stepped into the gloom, expecting them to vanish back into the forest. But they did not leave. The man, Silas, as she would later learn he was called, surveyed the cabin with a practical eye. He saw the leaking roof, the cold hearth, the despair clinging to the very walls. Without a word, he turned and walked into the woods, his son, Finn, trailing behind. He returned with an armload of dry wood. He struck a spark from 2 stones and nursed a small flame into a fire that pushed back the chill. It was the first act of kindness she had received in months. That simple fire was more than warmth. It was a statement. we are still alive. This could happen to anyone. The line between a home and a shelter is often just one small act of care, a silent pact formed in the days that followed. It was a partnership built on necessity, not words. Silas would disappear at dawn, returning with a rabbit for their stew or a fish from the creek. He used a shard of glass to whittle a new hinge for the door. He patched the roof with bark and mud. The official incident report from the auction, filed under case number 1888-72B at the Redemption Creek Sheriff's Office, lists Silas simply as vagrant poacher. It failed to mention he was a master carpenter and a skilled woodsman. He was rebuilding her world, one small, solid piece at a time. She, in turn, tended the meager garden and mended the tears in their clothes. She would leave food on the hearth, and in the morning, the bowl would be empty. The boy, Finn, was the first to cross the silent divide. One afternoon, he approached Alara and placed a smooth gray river stone in her hand. It was a simple offering, a child's treasure. That evening, as she hummed an old lullaby to herself, Finn crept closer and leaned his small head against her knee. She rested her hand on his hair, and he didn't pull away. In that moment, she wasn't just a widow waiting for a child, she was becoming a mother again. But peace on the frontier is a fragile thing. Little did she know, Jedediah was not a man to accept defeat. His greed was a fire that needed to consume everything. The first major twist in their story came not from a man, but from the land itself. While digging a new root cellar beneath the cabin, Silas's shovel struck something hard. It was not a rock. It was a 4x4 wooden post, buried deep, with a small brass plate nailed to it. The plate was stamped with the seal of the United States General Land Office and a set of survey coordinates. According to a land survey manual from 1885, these markers were the definitive, legal boundary of a homestead claim. Silas cleaned the dirt from the plate. The coordinates did not match the ones on the deed Jedediah had filed with the county clerk after her husband's death. Silas said nothing to Alara. What could he say? He was an indentured man, legally her property. A word from him held no weight against a man like Jedediah. But he reburied the marker carefully. This was a secret, a piece of leverage in a fight he knew was coming. He had seen this before. He knew that land disputes on the frontier were rarely settled with maps. They were settled with power and violence. National Archives records show that over 60% of homestead claim disputes in Colorado during that decade involved intimidation or outright fraud. Silas was holding a fact, but Jedediah held the power. The real story was just beginning. One night, Alara woke from a nightmare, screaming. In her dream, Jedediah was taking her baby, his face twisted in a mask of ownership. She sat up, shaking, her heart pounding. Across the small cabin, Silas was already awake, staring into the embers of the fire. The firelight flickered on his face, revealing an expression of deep, familiar sorrow. He understood nightmares. They didn't speak of it, but in the shared darkness, a new understanding passed between them. They were both survivors of men who took what they wanted. The fragile peace was shattered a week later. A friendly farmer from down the valley rode up, his face grim. "He's coming, Alara," the farmer warned. "Jedediah. He told the sheriff you're living with a savage. He says you're an unfit mother. They're forming a posse to come take the baby once it's born, for its own protection." The words were a physical blow. Her hand flew to her stomach. This was the moment she had been dreading. What would you do in this situation? Your home, your child, your very life is threatened by a lie. Silas stepped out from the trees. The quiet, gentle man was gone. In his place was the protector, the man from the cage. He began to work with a silent, deadly focus. He barred the door and shuttered the window. He retrieved a long rifle from a hidden cache in a hollow log, its mechanism meticulously cared for. The weapon was a frontier equalizer. He laid out his few remaining cartridges. Then he turned to Alara and held out the heavy knife he used for skinning game. "Not for them," he said, his voice a low rumble. "For you." She took it. The cold steel was a promise. She would not be a victim. "There's a better way," Alara said, her voice steady. She knew this land, its every rock and ravine. She drew a map in the dirt with a stick. She showed Silas a narrow bottleneck in the trail leading to the cabin, a perfect place for an ambush. She pointed out a hollow log where she and Finn could hide. He looked at her drawing and then at her face. He saw a strategist. He nodded. They were no longer a widow and her servant. They were partners. They prepared for a war they could not win with force but might survive with courage and truth. Wait for it. This gets even more unbelievable. They came at dawn. Jedediah, Sheriff Barlow, and a dozen men from the town, their faces set with self-righteous purpose. As they entered the narrow ravine Alara had marked, a cascade of rocks tumbled down the hillside, expertly dislodged by Silas. It was enough to panic the horses and throw the posse into chaos. But Jedediah, consumed by greed, scrambled up the rocks on foot, heading directly for the cabin. The standoff happened in the small clearing. Silas stood on the porch, rifle held loosely. "This is sheriff's business," Barlow blustered. "We're here for the woman and child." "She needs no protection from you." Silas's voice was calm, but carried the weight of the mountain behind him. At that moment, Alara stepped out from her hiding place, Finn clutching her hand. She faced her brother-in-law, her fear burned away by cold resolve. She held up a small, worn leather-bound book. "This was my husband's journal," she announced, her voice ringing with clarity. "The last entry he ever wrote. I'll read it to you." Jedediah's face went pale. "Here is the first shocking truth that rocked the community. My brother Jedediah came today," Alara read, her voice shaking but strong. "He offered to buy my claim for pennies, talking of a new geological survey that showed this land to be worthless. He brought a deed for me to sign. I told him no. I fear his greed. If anything should happen to me, do not trust him." She looked up, her eyes locking with the sheriff's. "My husband died in a hunting accident 2 days later. Jedediah filed the deed he brought that day, the one with my husband's forged signature on it." A murmur went through the posse. They were not here to save a baby. They were here to enforce a fraud. This is the moment that changes everything. Before the sheriff could respond, Silas stepped forward. "This is not about a journal," he said, his voice heavy with a lifetime of pain. "It's about this." He turned his back to the men and pulled his shirt over his head. The morning sun illuminated a tapestry of scars, old and new, from whips and brands. "My wife and I had a claim north of here, on Black Creek. The mining company wanted our water. They offered us nothing, so we refused. They sent men, just like you, led by a man just like him." He gestured towards Jedediah. "They called my wife a savage. They said our claim wasn't legal. They burned our home. They beat me and put me in a cage for defending it. They took my son." He pointed a finger at Jedediah. "That brand on the cage I was in, the brand of the Black Creek Mining Company, is the same company Jedediah has been secretly selling mining rights to on this land. Land he stole." This was the second shocking truth. It was never just about a small farm. It was about a corporate conspiracy. The posse members looked at each other, their certainty crumbling. They looked at Jedediah and saw not a concerned brother, but a thief and a monster. The old farmer who had warned Alara stepped out of the woods. "It's true," he said. "The land deed Jedediah filed at the county clerk's office, claim number 734, carries the wrong county seal. It's a forgery." The final truth, the one that broke the town's heart, came from Silas. "I was not poaching," he said, his voice cracking. "I was bringing flowers to my wife's grave. It is on the land Jedediah sold." The weight of it all settled over the clearing. The stolen land, the forged deed, the burned home, the desecrated grave. The men of the posse lowered their guns. They were not enforcers of the law. They were accomplices. One by one, they turned their backs on Jedediah and the sheriff. Tears streamed down the faces of hardened men as they understood their role in this tragedy. They rode away in silence, leaving Jedediah alone, exposed and defeated by the truth. In the weeks that followed, Redemption Creek changed. The truth, once revealed, could not be ignored. Sheriff Barlow was removed from his post by a citizens' council. Jedediah vanished, disappearing before formal charges could be brought. The town, in a collective act of penance, helped Alara and Silas rebuild. They brought lumber and seed, livestock and blankets. They brought apologies. Alara's daughter was born as the first spring wildflowers bloomed. She was born into a home secured not by law, but by courage. One evening, Alara sat on the newly built porch, the baby in her arms. Silas sat beside her, carving a small wooden bird for the infant. Finn slept peacefully, his head resting on Alara's lap. This collection of broken people had become a family. Welcome home, Silas, she said softly. He looked at her, his stormy eyes clear for the first time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the smooth gray stone Finn had given her. He had etched a picture on it, a tall man, a woman holding a baby, and a small boy standing between them, their hands linked. It was not a deed or a ring. It was a promise, a testament to the truth that a family is not something you own. It is something you build, something you protect, something you earn. They had found their redemption not in the town that bore the name, but in the quiet strength of each other. Dignity is not given, it is claimed. And in the heart of the mountains, the small family had claimed theirs. Share this story with someone who believes in the power of truth. Subscribe for more real stories of survival where endurance matters.